Well, on a Tuesday, we often will hear from Greg Bondar, the National Director of Christian Voice Australia. I mentioned a national think tank and advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. Greg, a special welcome back to 2020.
Oh, good morning, Neil, and hope you can hear me okay. I'm delighted to be here in Sydney again. I've just been travelling, preaching around the state, Neil, so I'm back in Sydney and looking forward to chatting to you.
Fabulous. And I know, Greg, that you are, you're prone to get out on those outback roads, visiting country, regional centres. You like to talk to people in cities too. In fact, I know you'll talk to people anywhere. So let's get into some of the issues today. You've done some research, and we'll often talk on this program, as you know, about religious persecution. And back in 2020, properties in 102 countries and territories were targeted in incidents tied to religion. That's, of course, been developing and growing. What is your research showing you?
Neil, thank you for that, because I'm not sure if you're aware, but the US Department of State has an annual publication called the International Religious Freedom Document. And in that document, it outlines what's happening in terms of religious persecution worldwide. Now, one of the things that I found out, I went through the document fairly clearly, is that Christian churches or properties, now they include churches, they could include pro-life centres, they could include anything to do with a Christian organisation. Those buildings are being vandalised, they're being targeted. And the report highlights that, in point of fact, Neil, that Europe has the highest share of countries where property attacks took place because of religion in the year 2020. And that's a bit disturbing, because followed by that is the Middle East and Africa, and then you've got the Asia Pacific region. Neil, it's really disturbing data coming out.
Well, just very recently, like in these past 2 to 3 weeks, Greg, and you might not be across all the details, but just to mention in here, we've been reporting and doing some updates on what's been happening in the northeast Indian state of Manipur, where something as many as 300 church buildings have been burned to the ground in a Hindu uprising. And so very challenging, and but interestingly, as you point to the fact that in Europe, that's the biggest number. And then these other regions, these are listed in context in this actual annual report.
Yeah, absolutely. And funny you should mention India, because I'm actually meeting with an associate professor from Notre Dame University tomorrow, Neil. I'm going to be talking about what is happening in India. So I have a real interest in that as well. But Neil, the point I want to make here is that when we're talking about attacks, we're talking about an attack on Christianity. And what's happening, Neil, is that churches are being burnt down. I mean, I get these reports daily from overseas. Churches are being burnt down. Pro-life centres are being targeted by way of, obscene paintings on their walls. You've got other buildings. I mean, you may even recall, Neil, do you remember the Australian Christian Lobby back some years ago was also targeted? So, what I'm afraid of is that if this targeting of Christian property, and in particular churches, continues, we're going to see this happening in Australia more and more. And I think we need to stand up to that now and take some, evasive action.
I think, Greg, we might be thankful to God that we actually live in a peaceable, harmonious nation. And I know that you will always say, let's not take that for granted. You've got to be able to actually stand up and expect those freedoms will continue. Sometimes I like to reflect on the fact that the very first church built in Australia was burnt down in an arson attack. And it's, probably not too far from where you are there in Sydney. And the first church in Australia was built by Richard Johnson, the first chaplain, and it was burnt down in an arson attack. This is not something that is unusual historically, and it does seem to be on the increase today. Hey, with all the studies that are going on, this is the focus here, that sometimes it's social groups or religious groups that have an uprising and cause these things to happen. But disturbingly, sometimes it's the governments. And so there's issues there, isn't there, when you work out who's doing these attacks?
Yeah, that's a good point you raised now, because one of the things people have got to realise is when we're talking about the attacks, we're talking about individuals and or social groups. but also governments, in particular, say China, where churches are being closed down. You've got governments that taking over property from the church organisations. And what's happening, Neil, is that it's very hard to get that back. And you can make a claim to try and get it, reverted to you from the government. But if you look at countries like Europe, and this is one of the things that really affects me, I guess, because I've got a lot of friends that are Jewish. Jewish cemeteries are being really targeted, Neil, in countries like, Bulgaria, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, and it is just not on. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, and I think we need to be very careful because we're talking here about religious persecution, whether it's property or people or cemeteries now.
Religious motivated violence, sometimes from social or religious groups within communities, and as you say, sometimes from governments who are happy to take from the church those things. And, a topic for another day, and we've been talking about this a lot, of course, the Calvary Hospital in Canberra, which is under a takeover from the government right now. It's church property, and the government is taking it over. Hey, there's plenty to talk about. Let's move on to the Australian Classification Review Board. You're thinking that films and books are out of control. Something needs to be done. What are your thoughts here?
Oh, Neil, look, I am really upset about this, and I think every listener ought to be as well. I had my granddaughter here yesterday, and I was just reading her some wonderful books, and one of the things that came across my mind was that all of a sudden, people aren't aware that if you're watching TV, if you're reading books, the use of profanity, the F and C words on TV, I don't know why they have to be on there. I'm talking about things like Netflix or Stan or whatever it might be. And I see some good movies on there, don't get me wrong. But those F and C words don't add anything to the value of the TV, don't add anything to the story. And then next minute I read about the gender queer book that's in libraries and in schools. Neil, I don't want my granddaughter and my grandson now reading these because, you see, we've got to protect the innocence of children. And unless we take some action now, we're going to regret it. And that's why I think the Australian Classification Review Board, who is now going to report back on the inquiry they had, will find out what the next step is, because these books have to be banned or at least put somewhere where no one can access them in terms of being children now.
Interesting to draw attention here. Sometimes we talk about a slippery slope, and whenever we're watching a Netflix movie, it just seems to be every one of them is littered with a lot of expletives, and we've become used to it. In fact, if you want to watch a movie these days, you've got to basically turn off your morality meter and say, well, we'll just put up with the swearing. And it's interesting because we're not actually prudish. We don't have some sort of attack, and we don't break out in a sweat if we hear a swear word. But what we do appreciate is this is just a part of a slippery slope, and because there's no censorship around swearing, all of a sudden there's no censorship around anything. And the Classification Review Board, they're obviously not censoring and thinking that people are not even interested.
No, the issue is, look, you and I, as I said, my wife watched a Netflix, a very good show. I won't mention what it is, but it's got the F word and what. It adds nothing to the dialogue. It adds nothing to the climax of the movie. Why have it? And I think we're being again indoctrinated to accept these words. And unfortunately, I'm so ashamed of myself that, like you, if you've mentioned, I'm getting used to it. I don't want to get used to it, because I don't think we need to use those words in a family viewing or even in our conversation. We don't need to use the word. So I'm really worried, and I think this is something that we're going to have to take more action on now.
And, we've talked about this sort of thing before. Some decades back, there was a change in Australian society that moved from what we know as censorship to classification. And so when you mentioned the Australian Classification Review Board, it's not a censorship review board anymore. It's just we put up with anything, we just give it a classification. So that really that's part of the slippery slope, isn't it? So how do you send a message to the Australian Classification Review Board?
Neil, I think we're going to have to go back to lobbying 101, so to speak. I think everyone listening to your program or listening to Vision, they need to write to the ARCB, and you can go into just Google Australian Classification Review Board. You can get their address, but you need to write to them and saying, get real and make sure that these sort of profanities, these sort of books, the genderqueer books, are not hitting our children. 2, write to your MP. That's very powerful. I'm not talking about sometimes even a phone call, because if you get 100 people ringing the same MP, they're going to start to take action. If you get 100 people writing letters, they're going to take action. Next thing is write to the newspapers. Keep hounding them, Neil, because they're the ones that we want to try and get onto. And of course, the 4th thing I recommend is get on radio. Get onto the mainstream radio, or even get onto Vision and get your voice heard. Because, Neil, these are powerful tools. See, one thing I learned, Neil, the left are very good at lobbying, and we need to pick up our game to do likewise, to get our values, our Christian values, heard in the public arena.
Interesting to mention Talkback Radio, because regular listeners to this program have an opportunity to call in, and usually we restrict those sorts of comments and calls around the topic that we're talking about on the day.
Correct.
But there are a lot of stations around Australia that have sort of a generalised open line talkback opportunity for people to raise whatever topic they want to raise. And so if you're concerned about these sorts of things, I don't think anyone's going to be super jealous if you switched off Vision for a little while and you went on to some other talkback radio programs and began to be salt and light in those radio communities. That would be a positive thing. Interestingly, because, you're working at this lobbying level, Greg Bondar, and you've been doing this for decades, and you do a wonderful job. So writing to MPs and getting all sorts of, petitions and things together. There's a certain target in all of that. But additional to that, there's this grassroots that has to hear the voice of the people as well. And that's how you do it, through Talkback Radio. And that's really one of your few opportunities, and social media.
Absolutely. And Neil, in point of fact, what we're doing at Christian Voice Australia, I'm going to be running a course on how to lobby, how to get your voice heard. It'll be, I'm going to do it over a webinar. I'll do it if people want to come and join it. It's great. But Neil, we need to get our voice heard. And I've got to, without being gratuitous, the work that you're doing, the work that Vision Christian Radio is doing is so much needed in our day that I just value the work you're doing, and really, if they get a chance, ring the mainstream radio stations. Your 4, what is it, in Queensland, you've got all those programs there. Just, even if it's a 5-minute chat, and if lucky if you can get on, but if you can, and you'd be surprised, Neil, how often you can squeeze in a comment that's not related to the topic.
Well, no matter where you're listening all around Australia, there will be other talk radio opportunities to make your voice heard. And when you think of that biblical concept, salt and light, that sometimes is just exactly what that means. Amen. Is just having your say, speaking up, because if you don't speak up, no one will speak up, and things will continue to deteriorate. Hey, let's pick up on this other element, and I was surprised to hear this, that gambling has the highest suicide rate of any addiction. What have you been researching around this, Greg?
Yeah, I certainly have been researching. I've been looking at some data from the UK, America, and of course our own Australian data. But I'm going to start a campaign called All Bets Off campaign, Neil. Yeah. And the campaign is really aimed at getting governments to realise. Now, there was an inquiry on it at the federal parliament. A submission has been made. We made a submission into it, and one of the things that we're really upset about is we've been Christian Voice Australia, and I've spoken to people about this, is that Neil, if you watch TV, I don't care which channel, and we're talking about the main channels, 10, 9, 7, you will find it in the news hour between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m, depending on your locality, there will be no fewer than 5, 6, 7 advertisements on gambling. Now, have a look at it tonight when you watch your TV. And you know what, Neil? That is peak family viewing, and that's influencing children, fathers, and even mothers, and that's got to stop. And I'm looking forward to really making this campaign a national issue, Neil.
Our kids are in the firing line because our kids can see that. And I think probably you and I would be on the same boat saying, well, if you're an adult and you've got plenty of money and you think that gambling is something good for you, who are we to actually stop you from doing that? But we're concerned about the kids. But interestingly, there are vulnerable people. And we can all go through periods of vulnerability, Greg. When you've got, a death in the family or some relationship breakdown, physical health issues. And there's a place you go when you try to feel good. And gambling is one of those, as might be alcohol, as might be drug taking, all sorts of things like that. And as we might say, put your faith in God. But people turn to gambling. And so anyone who's in a place of vulnerability actually is exposed to these things and likely to give that a go.
Oh, Neil, you make such a good point. My own research indicates, I've gone through a lot of data, that gambling tends to increase during times of, now you ready for this, Neil?
Yeah.
Grief or separation, breakdown of a relationship, changes in physical health, feeling of shame, depression, anxiety or stress, loss of work, including redundancy, isolation is one, and loneliness is another. And these all tend to lead to increase in gambling because people want to try and do something different. And yes, you mentioned earlier, and the research is there, gambling has the highest suicide rate of any addiction. Now, that should be worrying to every mum and dad, to every family, to children who've got dads. This is not on. So I'm actually meeting with a couple of MPs in Canberra next week, and we're going to talk about trying to get a private member's bill up or something to ensure that some sort of legislation is put in place to stop all these gambling advertisements during the news hour.
Well, Greg Bondar, there won't be a single listener who knows your name and our conversations that says, that Greg Bondar is sitting back on his laurels and not doing much. Thank you so much for your proactive way that you approach these things. You're well connected. You're in that area where you're making some diplomatic advances and you've got the best interests of the children and young people of Australia particularly really well at heart. Greg Bondar, let me point people to how they can connect with you. christianvoiceaustralia.blog. Now, Christian Voice Australia, national think tank, advocacy group for families, liberty and faith, relatively newly formed, but you might want to connect with christianvoiceaustralia.blog. Greg Bondar, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us once again today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil, and I'm blessed to be on your program.